They say Seoul is the city of souls, but tonight, this club felt like a graveyard for dreams. The spotlight was burning my skin, and the thick haze of cigar smoke tasted like ash in my throat. I closed my eyes, trying to find the note, but the man in the VIP booth shattered the moment with a sound of breaking glass. My eyes snapped open. The high, mournful note of the saxophone died in the air as the crystal tumbler shattered against the edge of the stage, spraying shards of glass and expensive amber liquid dangerously close to the hem of my gown. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the room. I stood frozen for a heartbeat, the microphone gripping my hand like a lifeline. At the center table, the only one that mattered in the velvet lounge, sat a man who looked like he owned the darkness. He was devastatingly handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features and hair as black as the ink on a death warrant. But it was his eyes that chilled me, cold, bored, and utterly devoid of human warmth. He didn't even look at me. He was looking at his watch, his other hand lazily gesturing for a waiter to clean up the mess he'd made, as if destroying things was just a mundane part of his Tuesday. Then, he did something worse. Without breaking his gaze from his wrist, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a thick stack of bills, and tossed them onto the stage. They fluttered down like dead leaves, landing on the glass shards. It was a dismissal, a payment for silence, a gesture that said, "You are noise. Here is money. Go away." My blood turned to magma. I wasn't just a singer. I was Ava. I was the woman who worked 3 jobs to keep my little sister in school. I was the woman who had fought for every inch of ground I stood on in a country that often looked at me like an alien. I signaled the pianist with a sharp slash of my hand. The music cut out instantly, leaving a ringing silence in the wake of the melody. Hello, my fierce hearts and midnight wanderers. Before we lose ourselves in this story, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button to let me know you're here. In the comments, tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight. I love seeing how far our dark romance family reaches. Your support means everything and keeps these stories alive. So, find a comfortable spot, dim the lights, and let's begin. I unhooked the microphone from the stand and placed it gently on the stool. The click of my heels on the wooden stage sounded like gunshots in the sudden quiet. I stepped down the stairs, ignoring the frantic waving of the club manager in the wings. My path was straight, my chin was high, and my destination was the devil in the bespoke Italian suit. The air around his table was heavy, colder than the rest of the room. 2 men in dark suits, massive and stone-faced, stepped forward to intercept me, but the man seated raised a single finger. They stopped instantly. It was a display of power so absolute it made my stomach knot. But I didn't slow down until I was standing directly over him. "You dropped something," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. He finally looked up. His eyes were dark voids, abysses that threatened to swallow the light. He looked at me not with anger, but with a mild, irritating confusion, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly started speaking. "I paid," he said. His voice was deep, a rich baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. "Stop singing. It is boring." The insult stung more than the glass. "I am not a jukebox you can kick when you want silence," I retorted, my voice rising so the whole hushed room could hear. "And I am not a stripper you can throw cash at. You ruined my set. You disrespected me." He picked up a fresh glass the waiter had trembled to place before him. He took a slow sip, his gaze dropping back to the amber liquid. "You are paid to entertain. You failed. Take the money and leave. You are giving me a headache." "I don't want your money," I hissed. "I want an apology." The table went so quiet I could hear the ice melting in his glass. The men around him looked terrified, their eyes darting between me and their boss, waiting for the explosion. The man sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. He set the glass down and stood up. He was tall, towering over me, radiating a heat and danger that made my skin prickle. He stepped into my personal space, shrinking the world down to just the two of us. Apology? He repeated, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. Do you know who I am? I don't care if you're the king of Korea, I said, tilting my head back to hold his gaze. You were rude. His lips twitched, not in a smile, but in a sneer. You have spirit. It is wasted on a second-rate singer. He reached out, his hand moving faster than I could react, and clamped his fingers around my wrist. His grip was iron, immovable. He didn't squeeze, but the threat of crushing force was there. He pulled me slightly closer, forcing me to stumble against his chest. The scent of him, sandalwood, gunpowder, and cold winter air, flooded my senses. Sit down, pour my drink, and maybe I will let you keep the money. The arrogance, the entitlement, the assumption that he could just grab me, handle me, own me. It snapped the last tether of my self-control. I didn't think. I didn't calculate the consequences, I just reacted. I wrenched my wrist against his grip, using the momentum to swing my free hand. Crack. My palm connected with his cheek with a force that jarred my shoulder. The sound was sickeningly loud, echoing off the velvet walls like a thunderclap. The entire club seemed to stop breathing. The bartender froze with a shaker in midair. The manager in the wings covered his mouth. The bodyguards' hands flew to the inside of their jackets, reaching for weapons, their faces twisted in shock and rage. I stood there, my hands stinging, my breath coming in ragged gasps, realizing what I had just done. I had just physically assaulted the most terrifying man in the room. The man, Gi-chul, though I didn't know his name then, didn't move. His head was turned slightly to the side from the impact of my slap. A red mark was already blooming on his pale skin, a stark contrast to his perfect composure. Slowly, terrifyingly slowly, he turned his face back to me. The bodyguard stepped forward, ready to tear me apart, but he held up a hand again. Silence reigned. He raised his hand to his face. His long fingers brushed the spot where I had struck him. He looked at me, his dark eyes widening slightly. The boredom was gone. In its place was something sharper, darker, and infinitely more dangerous. He touched his cheek, looking at me not with anger, but with dark, terrifying amusement. He whispered, interesting. The silence inside the club had been terrifying, but the noise that followed was worse. Mr. Choi, the club manager who had once praised my soulful vocals as the best in Gangnam, was now gripping my arm with hands that shook violently. He dragged me through the kitchen, past the confused cooks, his face a mask of sheer panic. Sweat beaded on his upper lip despite the air conditioning. You crazy bitch, he hissed, his voice trembling. Do you have a death wish? Do you know what you just did? That was Kim Gi-chul. You didn't just slap a man. You slapped the Grim Reaper. He grabbed me, I argued, stumbling as he shoved me toward the heavy metal exit door. I was defending myself. You were signing your death warrant. Mr. Choi screamed. He grabbed my coat from the hook and threw it at me. It hit my chest with a dull thud. Get out. Don't come back. Forget you ever worked here. If anyone asks, I don't know you. He slammed the back door open. The night air rushed in, wet and biting, carrying the smell of garbage and exhaust. He shoved me, hard. I stumbled out onto the wet asphalt of the alleyway, barely catching my balance before the heavy steel door slammed shut behind me. The deadbolt slid home with a final metallic clack. I stood there in the rain, clutching my cheap coat, the vibrations of the jazz bass still thumping faintly through the brick wall. I was shaking, but not from the cold. I looked at my hand, the hand that had struck the face of the silent king. It was still tingling. I expected to feel regret. I expected to feel fear. But standing there in the dirty alley, all I felt was a scorching, righteous anger. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself and walked away, telling myself that I would find another job tomorrow. I was wrong. The next 2 weeks were a slow, suffocating descent into hell. Seoul, usually a city of neon lights and endless opportunity, turned its back on me. I went to the Blue Note in Itaewon first. The owner took one look at my face and shook his head before I even opened my mouth. I went to the smaller, grimier dives in Hongdae. Same result. By the 4th day, I was applying to wash dishes in restaurants that smelled of old grease. On the 7th day, I walked into a small convenience store, asking for a stocking clerk position. The owner, an elderly woman with kind eyes, looked at my application. She paused, then looked up at me with profound pity. She leaned over the counter, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Child," she said softly, "your name is on the list. The Jum Ryong Syndicate has marked you. No one in Seoul will hire you. Not for singing, not for cleaning, not for breathing. You are a ghost." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind settled into my marrow. Jum Ryong, the Golden Dragon. I had heard the whispers, of course. Everyone had. They were the shadow government, the hands that moved the pieces of the city, and I had slapped their king in front of an audience. Desperation is a physical weight. It sits on your chest and makes every breath a labor. My landlord came knocking on day 10. I hid in the bathroom with the lights off, holding my breath as he pounded on the door, shouting about eviction. Later that night, my phone buzzed. It was Mia, calling from university. "Hey, Ava." Her voice was bright, oblivious. "Just checking in. The tuition deadline is next week. Is everything okay? You sound tired." "I'm fine, sweetie," I lied, my stomach cramping from hunger. I was staring at a half-eaten triangle of kimbap, the only food I'd had in 24 hours. Just a lot of late nights at the club. "The tips are great. Don't worry about the money. I'll send it." I hung up and cried until I was dry. I had $17 to my name. But the hunger wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the feeling of being watched. It started on the 3rd day. A sleek black sedan with tinted windows. It was always there. When I walked out of my apartment building, it was idling across the street. When I sat in the library to use the free heating, it was parked at the curb. When I walked home at night, the tires crunched slowly on the gravel behind me, pacing my footsteps. They never honked. They never rolled down the window. They were just there. It was psychological warfare. They were waiting for me to break. They were watching the rat starve in the maze. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening. The temperature had dropped to -10 degrees. The wind was a razor, slicing through the thin fabric of my coat. I had been kicked out of my apartment that morning. Locks changed. Bags on the curb. I had nowhere to go. I sat on a wooden bench in a small deserted park near the river. The cold seeped into my bones, making my joints ache. I was lightheaded from hunger. Across the street, the warm yellow glow of a bakery mocked me. I could smell the yeast and sugar, a torture I couldn't escape. I put my head in my hands. "Okay," I whispered to the freezing air. "You win. Just kill me and get it over with." As if summoned by my surrender, the crunch of tires on asphalt broke the silence. I didn't need to look up to know what it was. The black sedan. It pulled up to the curb right in front of my bench. The engine purred, a low, powerful rumble that sounded like a beast clearing its throat. I stayed seated. I was too tired to run, too tired to fight. If they were going to put a bullet in my head, at least the muzzle flash would be warm. The back door didn't open. Instead, the front passenger door clicked and swung wide. A man stepped out. He wasn't one of the bruisers I had seen at the club. He was slender, wearing a suit that cost more than my sister's entire tuition. He wore rimless glasses and had the calm, efficient demeanor of an accountant or an executioner who disliked messes. He walked toward me, his shoes clicking precisely on the frozen pavement. He stopped 3 feet away. He didn't look at me with lust, or anger, or pity. He looked at me like I was a file that needed to be sorted. "Miss Ava," he said. His voice was polite, terrifyingly normal. I looked up at him, my teeth chattering. "Are you going to kill me?" He adjusted his glasses. "If Mr. Kim wanted you dead, you would have ceased to exist 2 weeks ago. You would be part of the foundation of a new high-rise in Incheon. Then what?" I rasped. "Why are you following me? Why are you ruining my life?" "We are not ruining it," he said simply. "We are rearranging it." He gestured toward the back seat of the car. The dark tint of the window reflected my own haggard face, pale, exhausted, with dark circles under my eyes. I looked like a ghost. "Mr. Kim has a proposition," the man said. "He believes in balance. A debt was created when you struck him, a debt of disrespect. He is offering you a way to work it off." "Work it off?" I let out a dry, hysterical laugh. "Does he need a singer?" "No," the man said. "He needs a lesson in humility, and he thinks you are the perfect candidate to learn it." He opened the back door of the car. A wave of heat escaped from the interior, smelling of expensive leather and that same faint, woodsy scent of sandalwood I remembered from the club. It smelled like safety. It smelled like a trap. "The boss wants to see if your hand is as strong as your pride," the man said, looking me dead in the eye. "Get in." I looked at the cold, empty park. I thought of Mia, waiting for her tuition. I thought of my empty stomach. Then I looked at the dark maw of the car. It was a golden cage, I knew that. But outside, I was already dying. I stood up, my legs shaking. I buttoned my coat, lifted my chin, and walked toward the car. I wasn't going to crawl. If I was going into the devil's house, I would walk in on my own 2 feet. I slid into the back seat. The door closed with a solid, heavy thud, sealing out the cold, the wind, and the life I used to know. The elevator ride felt like an ascent to the gallows. It was a glass capsule shooting up the side of the Jum Ryong Tower, rising so fast my ears popped. Below me, the city of Seoul shrank into a grid of glittering lights, beautiful and indifferent. I was leaving the world of the living and entering the sky, where the air was thin and monsters breathed. Secretary Park stood silently beside me, his reflection in the glass ghostly and still. When the doors slid open with a soft chime, he stepped out and gestured for me to continue alone. "The last door on the left," he said. "Do not knock." I walked down a hallway that was wide enough to drive a car through. The floors were black marble, polished to a mirror shine so perfect I could see the scuff marks on my cheap boots with every step. The walls were lined with modern art, violent slashes of red and black paint that looked less like creativity and more like a warning. I reached the double doors at the end. They were heavy, dark wood. I took a breath that rattled in my chest, pushed them open, and stepped inside. The office was cavernous. 3 walls were entirely glass, offering a panoramic view of the city skyline that was dizzying. The room was freezing, the air conditioned to a temperature that felt unnatural. It smelled of leather, old paper, and that sharp metallic scent of ozone. And there he was. Kim Gi-chul sat behind a desk that looked like a slab of black obsidian. He was wearing a white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms that were corded with muscle. He was writing something, his head bent, a fountain pen moving rhythmically across a document. He didn't look up. I walked to the center of the room and stopped. I stood there, clutching my purse, waiting. A minute passed, then 2. The only sound was the scratch of his pen and the low hum of the ventilation. My legs, weak from hunger, began to tremble, but I locked my knees. I refused to sit unless told. I refused to fidget. If he was testing me, I would turn into a statue before I crumbled. He let the silence stretch until it was almost a physical weight, pressing against my eardrums. Then, without a word, he stopped writing. He capped the pen with a sharp click. He looked up. The force of his gaze was like a physical blow. Up close, in the harsh light of his office, he was even more terrifying than he had been in the club. His face was a mask of cold indifference, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and predatory. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was. He simply reached into a drawer, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and slid it across the obsidian desk toward me. It hissed as it moved. "Read," he commanded. I stepped forward and picked it up. It was an invoice. 1 bottle of 1964 Macallan Lalique. 85,000,001. Cleaning fees, VIP upholstery, 2,000,001. Disruption of business operations, 50,000,001. Personal injury and insult to the chairman, 100,000,001. Total due, 237,000,001. I stared at the number. The zeros swam before my eyes. 237,000,001. It was over $200,000. It was more money than I would see in 10 lifetimes. "You're joking," I whispered, the paper shaking in my hand. I can't pay this." "I know," Gichul said. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "You have $17 in your bank account. You have no job. You have no apartment. Then why give me this?" I demanded, fighting the urge to tear the paper in half. "To mock me? You know I can't pay. Just send me to jail." "Jail?" A corner of his mouth quirked up, cold and humorless. "The police do not handle my affairs, Ava. I handle my own." He tapped a key on his laptop, turning the screen to face me. My heart stopped. It was a photo of Mia, my little sister. She was walking out of the library at her university, smiling, holding a stack of books. The timestamp was from this morning. "Mia Evans," Gichul read from the screen, his voice devoid of emotion. "Sophomore at Yonsei University. International Studies major. GPA 3.8. Dormitory Building B, Room 304. Tuition deadline is in 3 days. Outstanding balance, 6,000,001. The blood drained from my face so fast the room spun. "Don't you touch her," I snarled, my voice low and dangerous. "If you go near her, I swear to God." "You will what?" He cut me off, his voice soft but striking like a whip. "Slap me again? Look at your position, Ava. You have nothing. I have everything." He closed the laptop. "Debts are inherited, Ava. If you can't pay, who will? Do you want your sister to inherit your mistakes? Do you want her to work off your balance?" The threat hung in the freezing air, toxic and heavy. I felt sick. He wasn't just threatening to hurt her. He was threatening to consume her future to pay for my pride. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice breaking. I felt tears pricking my eyes, but I blinked them back. "I'll do anything. Just leave her out of this." He opened a leather folder on his desk and pulled out a thick contract. "A solution. I will pay this debt. I will also pay your sister's tuition for the remainder of her degree. She will never know you were fired. She will never know you were starving. And in exchange?" I asked, my stomach churning. I looked at him, handsome, rich, and cruel. I thought of the stories I'd heard about powerful men and desperate women. "You want a mistress? You want me to warm your bed?" Gichul laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, like ice cracking. "Don't flatter yourself," he said, looking at me with disdain. "I don't pay for affection. Women throw themselves at me for free every day. Why would I pay for a woman who looks at me with such hatred?" He pushed the contract toward me. "You broke my peace," he said, "so you will maintain it. My previous housekeeper was inefficient. You need a home, I need my residence managed. You will cook, you will clean, you will handle my schedule, and you will ensure my life runs without friction. You will live in my house, where I can keep an eye on you. I stared at him. You want me to be your maid? I want you to be my property until your debt is cleared, he corrected. You will serve me. Absolute obedience. No questions. No defiance. And no slapping. He held out a heavy, black fountain pen. Sign, or get back on the street. And remember, if you walk out that door, I make a phone call to the dean of Yonsei University. I looked at the pen. I looked at the contract. The terms were slavery in all but name. I would be trapped in his house, under his thumb, subject to his whims. But then I looked at the black screen of the laptop where Mia's face had been. I took the pen. The metal was cold against my skin. I bent over the desk. My hand trembled, but I forced the nib onto the paper. The sound of the pen scratching across the signature line was loud in the silence. Scritch. Scratch. It sounded like a lock tumbling into place. It sounded like the heavy steel door of a prison cell slamming shut. I straightened up, leaving the signed contract on the desk. Gichul took the paper back. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just checked the signature. Satisfied. Welcome to the family, Ava, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. You start now. The floor is dusty. My world had shrunk to the span of a scrubbing brush and the endless expanse of black marble. The Jum Ryong estate wasn't a home. It was a mausoleum built for the living. It was a fortress of glass, steel, and stone nestled in the hills of Bukhansan, isolated from the city below. For 3 weeks I had been its prisoner, its keeper, and its ghost. My day began at 4 a.m. I woke up in a small, windowless room in the servants' quarters that smelled faintly of bleach. By 4:15, I was on my knees in the grand foyer. The floor was black marble, imported from Italy, and Gichol demanded it be reflective enough to see his sins in. My knees were bruised a permanent purple yellow. My hands, once soft enough to coax delicate melodies from a piano, were now red, chapped, and raw from harsh chemicals. The isolation was absolute. The other staff treated me worse than a leper. The head chef, a rotund man with a temper like a grease fire, would smack my hand with a ladle if I reached for a snack during prep. The guards, stone-faced statues in dark suits, looked right through me. To them, I wasn't a person. I was the debt slave. I was the woman who had dared to touch the king. And now I was paying for it in sweat and silence. Gichul was the architect of my misery. He didn't beat me. He didn't yell. He did something far more sadistic. He gave me impossible tasks and then watched, with cold, reptilian patience, to see if I would break. The library is dusty, he would say, walking past me as I finished an 8-hour shift. Clean every book. You have 2 hours. There were 4,000 books in that library. I would grit my teeth, nod, and start climbing the ladders. I refused to cry. I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing my shoulders slump. Instead, I found a weapon he couldn't take away from me. I sang. It started as a hum, a way to keep the rhythm while I polished the endless silver cutlery. But soon, it grew. When I was alone in the vast echoing hallways, I let my voice loose. I sang low, smoky jazz ballads that bounced off the cold stone walls. I sang Nina Simone while I scrubbed the toilets. I sang Etta James while I ironed his crisp white shirts. The music was an act of rebellion. It filled the sterile, silent house with warmth, with grit, with life. At first, Gichol seemed annoyed. He would slam his office door shut when the melody drifted up the stairs. But as the days turned into weeks, the slamming stopped. Sometimes, when I was singing in the kitchen, I would feel a heaviness in the air. I would turn around, and he would be there, standing in the doorway, a glass of water in his hand, watching me. He wouldn't speak. He would just stare, his expression unreadable, as if he were trying to solve a complex equation. Then he would turn and vanish into the shadows, leaving the scent of sandalwood lingering in the air. One night the exhaustion finally caught up to me. It was nearly 3 a.m. Ji-chul had been hosting a late meeting with his lieutenants, and I was required to stay awake until the last guest left to clean up the brandy snifters. I had retreated to the library to wait. I sat on the floor, leaning against a towering shelf of history books. My body felt like lead. On my lap was a tattered workbook I had found in the recycling bin, Introduction to Korean Grammar. I wasn't just going to scrub floors. If I was going to survive in this den of vipers, I needed to understand what they were saying. I needed to know when they were plotting, when they were lying, when they were threatening. I was tracing the Hangul characters with a tired finger, murmuring the sounds under my breath. Sa. Sarong? No. Sagwa. Apple. The letters blurred. My head grew heavy. The silence of the room wrapped around me like a blanket, and I drifted off. I woke up to the sensation of being watched. It wasn't a gentle awakening. My internal alarm screamed that a predator was nearby. I gasped, jerking upright, the book sliding off my lap and hitting the floor with a loud thwack. Ji-chul was standing over me. He had removed his suit jacket. His tie was loosened, hanging slightly askew around his neck, and the top 2 buttons of his shirt were undone, revealing a glimpse of tanned skin. He looked exhausted, his hair slightly messy, shadows under his eyes. He looked human. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering against my ribs. I'm sorry. I was just waiting for the guests to leave. I didn't mean to fall asleep. He didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the book on the floor. He nudged it with the toe of his expensive Oxford shoe. Studying? He asked, his voice rough with fatigue. Yes, I said, lifting my chin. Unless that's forbidden in the contract, too. He looked at me then. Really looked at me. His gaze traveled from my messy bun, down my tired face, to the apron stained with furniture polish. You are wasting your time, he said flatly. You will never speak it well enough to matter. I learn fast, I shot back. He stepped closer. The air in the room seemed to condense, becoming thick and charged. You missed a spot, he said. I frowned, looking around frantically. Where? I dusted this whole room twice. Up there. He pointed to a shelf high above my head, near the ceiling. The 3rd volume of the Joseon Dynasty records. There is dust on the spine. I can't reach that, I said, frustration bubbling up. Even with the ladder, I can't reach that. Excuses, he murmured. He stepped in. He moved into my personal space, ignoring the boundaries that usually separated master and servant. I backed up until my shoulder blades hit the bookshelf. I was trapped. He didn't stop. He came so close that the toes of his shoes touched mine. He raised his arm, reaching up toward the high shelf. His body pressed against mine for a split second. It was accidental, unavoidable, but it felt like an electric shock. I felt the heat radiating off him, burning through the thin fabric of his shirt and my apron. I smelled him, the sharp, clean scent of expensive soap, mixed with the dark, woody aroma of tobacco and that intoxicating sandalwood. He was overwhelming. He was a wall of muscle and heat, towering over me. My breath hitched in my throat. I looked up, and my gaze locked on his throat, watching his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed. He didn't grab the book. His hand hovered near the shelf, but he stopped. Slowly, he lowered his gaze. He wasn't looking at the dust. He was looking at me. His eyes were dark, dilated, the pupils swallowing the irises. The cold indifference was gone, replaced by a raw, hungry intensity that made my knees weak. He looked at my mouth, his gaze lingering on my lips as if he were contemplating tasting them. The silence was deafening. It wasn't the silence of an empty house anymore. It was the silence of a held breath before a plunge. My heart was beating so loud I was sure he could feel it against his chest. For a moment I thought he was going to kiss me. The hatred, the resentment, the power dynamic, it all blurred into a sharp, terrifying point of desire. I saw his hand twitch, his fingers curling as if he wanted to touch my face. Then, the mask slammed back into place. His jaw tightened. The fire in his eyes was doused by a sudden wash of cold restraint. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of my ear. His breath was hot, sending shivers racing down my spine. "You missed a spot," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through my entire body. He pulled back abruptly, putting 3 feet of distance between us in a single stride. He grabbed his jacket from the back of a chair, not looking at me again. "Clean it," he commanded, his voice harsh, almost angry. "And then go to bed. You look terrible." He stormed out of the library, his footsteps echoing like gunshots on the hardwood floor. I stood there, pressed against the bookshelf, my chest heaving, my skin burning where his body had touched mine. I reached up and touched my ear, which still tingled from his whisper. I was terrified. I was confused. But more than anything, I was shocked to realize that for a fleeting second, I hadn't wanted him to stop. The summons didn't come with a polite knock. It came with Secretary Park nearly tearing the door to the laundry room off its hinges. "Leave the sheets," he commanded, his usually calm face flushed with uncharacteristic stress. "You are needed upstairs. Immediately." "I'm not done with the linens," I said, wiping suds from my forearm. "And Mr. Kim was very specific about." "Mr. Kim does not care about the linens right now," Park snapped, grabbing my elbow. "His translator has been hospitalized. Appendix burst. The meeting with the Bukhan clan is in 20 minutes. You are the only person in this house who speaks both English and enough Korean to not embarrass us. Move." I was half dragged through the service corridors, up the back stairs, and into a guest suite I had never been allowed to enter. On the bed lay a dress. It was a simple, sleeveless black sheath made of silk that looked like it cost more than my entire life's earnings. "Put it on," Park ordered, turning his back. "Fix your hair. You are not a maid tonight. You are a shadow. You pour the wine, you translate the numbers, and you do not speak unless spoken to." I stripped off my damp uniform, my heart pounding. I hadn't worn anything beautiful since the night I was fired. The silk slid over my skin like cool water, hugging my curves in a way that felt dangerous. I pinned my hair up swiftly, leaving a few tendrils loose to frame my face, and applied a coat of red lipstick I found on the vanity. When I looked in the mirror, the tired, debt-ridden cleaner was gone. Ava the jazz singer was back. She looked fierce. She looked ready for war. I walked into the dining room exactly 2 minutes before the guest arrived. Gi-chul was standing by the fireplace, swirling a glass of whiskey. He looked tense, his shoulders tight under his dark navy suit. When he heard my heels click on the parquet floor, he turned around, an impatient scowl already forming on his lips. The scowl vanished. He froze. His hand stopped moving the glass. His gaze swept over me, starting from the heels, moving up the curve of my hips, the line of my throat, and finally locking onto my eyes. For 5 seconds, the silent king was struck dumb. The air between us crackled, hot and sudden. He didn't look at me like a servant he wanted to break. He looked at me like a man who had forgotten what beauty looked like. Then, he blinked, and the mask returned. "You are late," he said, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "Do you understand the instructions?" "Pour. Translate. Be invisible," I recited. "Good. This man, Choi Min-sok. They call him the Viper. He is crude, but powerful. Do not let him provoke you. The doorbell chimed. A moment later, the double doors opened, and the Viper slithered in. Choi Min-sok did not look like a mob boss. He looked like a used car salesman who had won the lottery. He was short, thick-necked, and wore a suit that was too shiny. He smelled of garlic and cheap cologne that clashed violently with the clean, expensive scent of Gi-chul's home. The dinner was an exercise in torture. I stood silently behind Gi-chul's chair, stepping forward only to refill glasses or translate specific technical terms about shipping routes and cargo manifests. The Viper ate with his mouth open, smacking his lips, and drank wine like it was water. He spoke mostly in broken English, clearly trying to assert dominance by forcing Gi-chul to speak his language. But as the wine flowed, he switched back to Korean, his tone becoming slurred and aggressive. "You are too stiff, Kim," Choi laughed, spitting a bit of duck onto the tablecloth. "You need to relax. That is why your territory is stagnant. No passion." Gi-chul remained composed, slicing his steak with surgical precision. "Discipline is not stagnation, Choi. It is stability." Choi's eyes drifted away from Gi-chul. They landed on me. He leered. It was a disgusting, undressing look that made my skin crawl. He looked at my bare arms, my waist, my lips. Then he turned to his lieutenant seated next to him and laughed. He switched to a rapid slang-heavy Korean, assuming the dumb American maid wouldn't catch the nuance. "Look at this one," Choi sneered, gesturing at me with his fork, black as a shadow, but built like a brick house. I didn't know the Silent King had a taste for exotic pets. "Did you pick her up in Itaewon? How much for an hour with the animal?" The room went dead silent. I saw Gi-chul's hand tighten on the stem of his wine glass. His knuckles turned white. The glass groaned, a hair's breadth from shattering. His jaw locked, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He was about to move. I knew that look. He was about to reach across the table and drive a steak knife through the Viper's hand. If he did that, the deal was dead. War would start. People would die. I didn't think. I moved. I stepped forward, moving smoothly between the men. I picked up the bottle of 1982 Bordeaux. My face was a mask of serene, polite indifference. "More wine, Mr. Chua?" I asked in English. He smirked up at me, thinking he had gotten away with it. "Yeah. Fill it up, sweetheart." I began to pour. The red liquid spiraled perfectly into his glass. As I poured, I spoke. Not in English, and not in the rough, slangy Korean he had used. I spoke in Gungjung Mal, the high, formal court language of the old Joseon royalty, the kind used in historical dramas I had been mimicking to practice my pronunciation. It was the language of queens addressing subjects. "A true king does not need to bark to be heard. Honored guest," I said, my Korean flawless, my tone dripping with icy, aristocratic politeness. And a man of true quality knows that one does not price a diamond as if it were common glass. Perhaps this wine will help wash the bitterness of your ignorance from your tongue. I finished pouring with a flourish and twisted the bottle so not a single drop spilled. The silence that followed was absolute. Choi Min-sok's fork clattered onto his plate. His mouth fell open. He turned a deep, blotchy shade of red. He looked at me, then at Gi-chul, completely stunned that the pet had just verbally castrated him with better manners than he would ever possess. I stepped back into the shadows, clutching the bottle to my chest to hide the shaking of my hands. Gi-chul slowly released his grip on his wine glass. He turned his head to look at Choi, and for the first time in months, he laughed. It wasn't the cold, sharp sound I was used to. It was a rich, genuine baritone chuckle that rumbled from his chest. He looked at Choi's stunned face, and then he looked up at me. His eyes were shining. There was no anger. There was no coldness. There was only a fierce, burning pride. "She has teeth," Gi-chul said softly to the room. Choi stood up, his face burning. He muttered something about a sudden engagement, gathered his men, and practically fled the room. He had been outmaneuvered, humiliated not by a gun, but by a woman he deemed beneath him. When the front door slammed shut, the house fell quiet. Gichol didn't stand up. He remained seated at the head of the table. He picked up his glass and took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving mine. The tension in the room had shifted. The barrier of master and servant felt thin, brittle. "Come here," he said quietly. I walked to the side of his chair. He swiveled to face me. He reached out and took the wine bottle from my hands, setting it on the table. Then he looked at my hands, still trembling slightly. "I was going to kill him," Gichul admitted, his voice low. "You saved his life, and my business. He disrespected you," I said, my voice steadying. "And me. Yes." He looked up at my face, searching it. "You spoke to him like an empress addressing a peasant. It was vicious." He stood up then, closing the distance between us. He was close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. He reached out, his fingers hovering for a moment before he tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. His touch was electric, burning a trail down my neck. "Where?" he whispered, staring at my lips. "Did you learn to speak like a knife?" "I'm a quick learner," I breathed, unable to look away. "Yes," he murmured, his gaze darkening with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "You are." The adrenaline from the dinner was slowly fading, replaced by a strange, heavy quiet inside the armored cabin of the Maybach. Outside, Seoul was weeping. A torrential winter rain lashed against the tinted windows, blurring the neon lights of the city into streaks of violent color. Gichul didn't take me back to the servants' quarters. He signaled the driver, Mr. Han, to take the long route along the Han River. We sat in the back, the leather partition raised, sealing us in a private world of darkness and leather. He watched me. His gaze wasn't predatory anymore. It was heavy with unasked questions. He held a tumbler of water, but he wasn't drinking. "The song," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the hum of the engine. "The one you were singing in the kitchen yesterday. I put a spell on you." I looked at him, surprised. "You heard that?" "I hear everything in my house," he murmured. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. The movement brought his face into a slice of passing streetlight. "You have a voice that makes men stop breathing. Why are you scrubbing floors, Ava? Why did you stop fighting for the stage?" "I didn't stop fighting," I said softly, looking out at the rain. "The world just started fighting back harder. When my mom died, the music, it felt too heavy to carry alone." He was quiet for a long moment. "Heaviness," he whispered, as if tasting the word. "Yes, I know that weight." He reached out. His hand, warm and calloused, covered mine on the leather seat. It was a tentative gesture, shocking in its gentleness. "Maybe," he started, "you do not have to carry it alone, Enim." The world ended in a screech of tearing metal. A massive force slammed into the right side of the car like the fist of God. The impact was so violent it lifted the 2-ton armored vehicle off the ground. I was thrown against the door, my head cracking against the glass. And then the world spun. Once. Twice. A dizzying kaleidoscope of shattering glass and screaming steel. The car crashed down onto its chassis, skidding sideways across the wet asphalt until it slammed into the concrete guardrail with a bone-jarring crunch. Total darkness. For a moment, there was only the high-pitched ringing in my ears, and the hiss of steam escaping a broken radiator. The air was thick with the suffocating chalky taste of deployed airbags, and the sharp scent of spilled gasoline. "Gichul?" I coughed, the smoke stinging my throat. "Gichul." A low groan answered me. I pushed the deflated airbag aside. The partition between us and the driver was shattered. Mr. Han was slumped over the wheel, his neck at an unnatural angle. He was gone. I turned to Gichul. He was pinned against the far door, a trickle of dark blood running from his hairline down his pale temple. His eyes were half open, glazed and unfocused. He was conscious, but barely. "Get out," he rasped, his voice slurred. "Ava. Get out." I reached for the door handle. It was jammed. I kicked it, panic rising in my throat like bile. It gave way with a groan of twisted metal swinging open into the pouring rain. I scrambled out, falling onto the wet pavement. The cold rain hit me like a shock, sharpening my senses. I looked up. 3 black SUVs had blocked the road. Men were pouring out of them, men in rain slickers, holding baseball bats and silenced pistols. They weren't police. They were cleaners. The Viper's men. "Check the car." One shouted in Korean, "Make sure the king is dead." I froze. I was in the shadows, behind the wreckage. I could run. The alleyway was 5 feet away. I could disappear into the dark, wet maze of Seoul. I could be free. The debt, the contract, the danger, it could all end right here. I looked back at the car. Gichul was trying to move, his hand fumbling for a weapon that wasn't there. He looked trapped. He looked alone. Debts are inherited. Damn it, I hissed through my teeth. I didn't run away. I dove back into the wreckage. I climbed over the center console, ignoring the glass slicing into my palms. I grabbed Mr. Han's shoulder holster. It was empty. The gun had slid across the floorboard. I scrambled for it, my fingers closing around the cold steel of a semi-automatic pistol. I didn't know how to shoot, but I knew how to threaten. "Gichul, move," I screamed, grabbing him by the lapels of his suit. He looked at me, his eyes widening, clearing slightly. "Ava? Go. Shut up and move." I dragged him. He was dead weight, heavy with muscle and concussion. I pulled him across the seat just as the first attacker reached the window. The man raised a bat to smash the remaining glass. I didn't think. I raised the gun and fired blindly through the shattered window. Bang. The sound was deafening in the confined space. The bullet went wide, sparking off the pavement, but the attacker flinched and dove for cover. "Come on," I grunted, hauling Gichul out onto the wet asphalt. He stumbled, finding his footing. He gripped my shoulder, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. Together we lurched toward the alleyway. "They're running. The girl has a gun," someone shouted behind us. Bullets started to fly. Thwip, thwip, thwip. They hit the car, the pavement, the wall next to my head, sending sprays of concrete dust into my eyes. We sprinted, or as close to sprinting as we could manage. Gichul was limping heavily, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. We plunged into the labyrinth of the back streets, the narrow alleys smelling of garbage and old frying oil. The rain was our cover, a curtain of gray washing away our scent and footprints. We ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. We turned left, then right, deeper into the shadows where the neon lights couldn't reach. Gichul stumbled. He hit a brick wall and slid down it, leaving a smear of dark blood on the rough stones. He landed in a puddle, his head lolling forward. I dropped to my knees beside him, the gun clattering to the ground. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely touch him. I checked his head. The cut was deep, the blood flowing too fast. "Gichul," I whispered, tapping his cheek. "Stay with me. We have to keep moving." He opened his eyes. They were dark, swimming with pain. He looked at me, then at the entrance of the alley. "Leave me," he groaned. He tried to push my hand away, but his grip was weak. "They want the head of the dragon. They don't care about the maid. Go, Ava. Save yourself." It would have been the logical choice. It would have been the smart choice. I grabbed his lapels again, shaking him hard, snapping his head back. "No," I shouted, my voice cracking over the sound of the rain. "I don't run. Do you hear me? I don't run." "You are free," he wheezed, blood staining his teeth. "The contract is void." I decide when the contract is void. I yelled, tears mixing with the rain on my face. I grabbed his arm and hauled it over my shoulder, using my entire body as a crutch for him. "And I haven't paid my debt yet, you stubborn ass. You don't get to die until I say we're even. Now get up." He looked at me. In the filth of the alley, bleeding and broken, he looked at me with a mixture of shock and something that looked dangerously like awe. He gritted his teeth. With a roar of effort that sounded like an animal in a trap, he forced his legs to work. He stood up, leaning his entire weight on me. "Bossy," he muttered, his voice faint but amused. "Walk," I commanded. Together, two broken shadows fused into one. We limped deeper into the darkness. The door clicked shut, severing the connection to the rain-soaked hell outside. The lock tumbled with a rusty protesting screech that sounded loud enough to wake the dead, but the hallway remained silent. We were safe, or as safe as two hunted animals could be in a concrete box. The safe house was little more than a forgotten memory in the crumbling district of Myeongdong. It was a single room that smelled of trapped dust, old paper, and stale air. There was no furniture except for a narrow iron bed with a bare mattress and a single wooden chair. The windows were covered with yellowed newspapers, peeling at the corners. Gichol didn't make it to the bed. He took 2 steps into the room. His knees buckled, and he collapsed. I caught him, or tried to, my body straining against his dead weight as we both slid down to the dusty floor. "Gichol," I gasped, scrambling to my knees. He was pale, a terrifying ghostly gray that made the blood on his temple look violently bright. His breathing was shallow, a wet, rattling sound in his chest. "Floorboard," he wheezed, his eyes fluttering shut. "Under the window." "Kit." I didn't ask questions. I crawled to the window, my fingernails digging into the gap between the rotting wood planks. I pried one loose. Underneath lay a metal box marked with a red cross and a bottle of clear, unmarked liquor. I grabbed them and ran back to him. "I need to get you on the bed," I said, my voice shaking. "Come on. One more time. Please." I don't know where the strength came from. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the lingering adrenaline. But I managed to haul the King of Seoul up from the floor and onto the mattress. The spring screamed under his weight. I fumbled with the latch of the metal box. Inside there were bandages, gauze, a scalpel, and a suture kit. Curved needles. Thread. I looked at his side. His suit jacket was soaked through, the expensive navy wool black with blood. "I have to cut this," I whispered. He didn't answer. He was drifting. I took the scalpel. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped it. I took a deep breath, forcing the air into my lungs, willing my fingers to still. "You are not a singer right now," I told myself. "You are the only thing standing between him and the grave." I sliced through the fabric of a suit that cost more than my father's house. I peeled back the layers, the jacket, the vest, the white dress shirt now ruined and clinging to his skin. When I stripped the fabric away, I gasped. His torso was a masterpiece of violence. Old scars, silver and jagged, crisscrossed his ribs and chest, telling stories of knives and bullets I didn't want to know. But dominating his back and curling over his shoulder was a tattoo, a massive, intricate golden dragon, its scales detailed enough to look real. But the dragon was bleeding. A shard of metal from the car door had sliced a deep gash just above his hip. It wasn't hitting an organ, but it was deep. Too deep to just bandage. "It needs stitches," I said, feeling bile rise in my throat. I looked at his face. He was watching me, his eyes half open, dark and glassy with pain. "Do it," he breathed. I opened the bottle of liquor. The smell of cheap, high-proof soju filled the small room, overpowering the scent of dust. This is going to burn. I poured the alcohol over the wound. Gi-chul's back arched off the mattress. A guttural groan tore from his throat, his hands gripping the metal frame of the bed so hard the knuckles turned white. He didn't scream. He refused to scream. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears pricking my eyes. I dabbed the wound clean with gauze. Then I threaded the needle. The next 20 minutes were an eternity suspended in silence. I sat on the edge of the bed, my knees touching his hip. The room was so quiet I could hear the rain tapping softly against the glass, a stark contrast to the violence of the crash. I had to hurt him to save him. I pinched the skin together. I pushed the needle through. Push. Pull. Not. My hands were covered in his blood. It was warm, sticky, and terrifyingly real. Every time the needle pierced his skin, his muscles twitched under my fingertips. I could feel the heat radiating off him, a fever already beginning to build. I leaned in close, my face inches from his bare chest, focusing on the tiny gruesome task. I could smell him. Beneath the copper scent of blood and the sharp tang of alcohol, there was still that faint trace of sandalwood and rain. Ava, he whispered. I paused, the needle hovering. I looked up. He was looking at me. The pain had stripped away the arrogance, the coldness, the walls he built around himself. He looked young. He looked human. You are shaking, he murmured. I'm terrified, I admitted, my voice barely audible. He moved his hand. Slowly, heavily, he reached out and covered my blood-stained hand with his own. His skin was burning hot. Don't be, he said, his voice a slur of delirium and honesty. You are warm. Everything else is cold, but you are warm. He closed his eyes, his thumb brushing against my wrist, tracing the pulse that fluttered there like a trapped bird. I finished the stitches. I bandaged him tightly. I covered him with a thin, moth-eaten wool blanket I found at the foot of the bed. The fever came an hour later. He burned. He thrashed in his sleep, muttering names I didn't know, issuing orders to ghosts. I didn't sleep. I found a bucket in the corner, filled it with rainwater from a leak in the ceiling, and tore a strip from my own petticoat. I spent the night sitting on the floor beside the bed, cooling his forehead with the damp cloth. I held his hand when he reached out into the dark. I whispered to him, singing soft, wordless lullabies when he seemed to be fighting demons in his dreams. The intimacy of it was overwhelming. There were no guards, no contracts, no debts. Just a man and a woman in a dark room, fighting for the dawn. I traced the line of his jaw with my thumb. I brushed the damp hair back from his forehead. I memorized the shape of his face in the shadows. Sometime near dawn, the thrashing stopped. His breathing evened out. The heat radiating from his skin broke, leaving him cool and damp. I didn't dare get into the bed. I pulled the wooden chair over to the door, jamming it under the knob. I sat down, my body aching in every joint. I picked up the gun I had stolen from the dead driver. It was heavy and cold in my lap. I rested my head against the doorframe, just for a moment. Sunlight, gray and filtered through layers of grime, woke me. I jerked awake, my hand instantly tightening on the grip of the gun. The room was still. The rain had stopped. I looked toward the bed. Gi-chul was awake. He was propped up on one elbow, the blanket pooling around his waist. The bandage on his side was stark white against his tanned skin. He looked pale, exhausted and battered, but his eyes were clear. The fever was gone. He wasn't looking at the door. He wasn't looking for his phone. He was looking at me. He stared at me curled up in the hard wooden chair, wearing a ruined evening gown, my hair a mess, clutching a semi-automatic pistol with both hands, like a holy relic. He looked at the gun. Then, he looked at my face. The silence stretched between us, thick with dust and motes of light. He didn't say thank you. He didn't ask for water. Slowly, he lowered his gaze to his side, touching the bandage I had stitched. He traced the line of it, as if reading a message I had carved into his skin. Then he looked back at me. The look in his eyes had changed. The amusement was gone. The calculation was gone. In its place was something darker, heavier, and infinite. It was the look of a man who had found something he didn't know he had lost. It was the look of a dragon realizing it had found its pearl. His lips moved, shaping a single word that didn't make a sound, but echoed louder than a gunshot in the quiet room. Mine. The morning sun did not bring warmth. It brought reality crashing back down on us. Secretary Park arrived at the safe house at 7 a.m. with a convoy of 3 armored SUVs and a team of medics. When he saw Gi-chul, bandaged, pale, but alive, the relief on his face was so profound, it looked painful. But when he saw me, standing beside the dragon with a gun in my hand and a fierce, protective scowl on my face, his expression shifted to something closer to respect. The return to the Jumryong estate was a spectacle. The staff lined up in the foyer, heads bowed, terrified that their master had almost been taken from them. Gi-chul refused the stretcher. He refused the wheelchair. He walked in on his own 2 feet, but he leaned heavily on me. His arm was draped over my shoulders, his hand gripping my arm, not to restrain me this time, but to anchor himself. "Take her to the blue suite," Gi-chul commanded, his voice raspy but brooking no argument. He addressed the head housekeeper, who looked as if she had swallowed a lemon. "She is no longer staff, she is a guest under my personal protection. Anyone who disrespects her answers to me." The silence in the foyer was absolute. The blue suite was reserved for heads of state and family. I was whisked away. For the first time in months, I showered in a bathroom with heated floors. I washed the blood and grime from my hair, watching the pink water swirl down the drain. I put on fresh clothes, clean soft linen trousers and a cashmere sweater that had been laid out for me. I looked in the mirror. The fear was gone. In its place was a quiet, fragile hope. I thought about his hand on mine in the dark. I thought about the word mine. I allowed myself to believe, just for a moment, that the nightmare was over. I was wrong. The nightmare had just changed shape. While I was washing the scent of the safe house off my skin, a viper had entered the garden. Her name was Yoon Soo-min. She was the daughter of the Hansung clan, a conglomerate heiress, and Gi-chul's fiancé by arrangement. She was porcelain perfect, with hair like silk and eyes that looked like frozen ponds. She had been absent for months, traveling in Paris, but news of the assassination attempt had brought her running back, not out of love, but out of territorial instinct. I was summoned to the office an hour later. I walked down the hallway, my heart light. I knocked on the heavy oak doors and entered. The temperature in the room hit me like a physical wall. It was colder than the night in the alley. Gi-chul was sitting behind his obsidian desk. He had been cleaned up, his hair slicked back, a fresh shirt covering the bandages I had stitched. But his face was a mask of stone. The vulnerability I had seen in the safe house was gone, replaced by a hardness that terrified me. Standing near the window was Soo-min. She wore a white suit, immaculate and sharp. She looked at me as I entered, her lips curving into a small, pitying smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sir?" I asked, stopping in the center of the room. "You asked for me?" Gi-chul didn't look up. He was staring at a folder on his desk. His hand was clenched into a fist, resting on the polished black surface. "I told you she was a stray dog," Soo-min said, her voice light and melodic, like wind chimes made of ice. "And you know what they say about strays, darling. If you feed them, they bite." "Gi-chul, what is going on?" I took a step forward. "Do not," he said. His voice was a low growl, vibrating with suppressed violence. Do not say my name. He picked up an object from the desk and threw it. It skidded across the marble floor and stopped at my feet. It was a cheap, disposable burner phone. We found it taped under the mattress in your old room, Gichul said, finally looking at me. His eyes were dead, along with the bank records. I don't understand, I said, my stomach dropping. That's not mine. Read the texts, he commanded. I picked up the phone. My hands started to shake. I opened the message history. Target moving. Departing 2000. Route B. Via Han River. Driver +1. No backup. The timestamp was 5 minutes before we had left the mansion for the dinner. And the payment, Su Min added, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. 500 million won, transferred to an offshore account under the name Ava Evans's this morning. A nice retirement fund. I stared at the paper. It looked real. The account number, the name, the amount. It was a perfect fabrication. I didn't do this, I whispered, looking up at him. Gichul, you know I didn't do this. I was with you. I saved you. Or maybe you were cleaning up a mess that went wrong, Su Min interjected smoothly. You panicked when the car didn't explode. You had to play the hero to survive. Shut up. I snapped at her, then turned back to him. Gichul, look at me. I stitched you up, I dragged you through the mud. Why would I do that if I wanted you dead? Because you are a mercenary, he said coldly. Because you have a sister who needs money. Because everyone has a price. He stood up. The pain in his side made him wince, but he ignored it. He walked around the desk, closing the distance between us. He didn't look like the man who had held my hand. He looked like the monster the world feared. The route was changed 10 minutes before we left, he said softly. Only Mr. Han knew, and me, and the person sitting in the back seat. I didn't know the route. I cried. I was just looking out the window. Lies, he hissed. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. A sleek, black Beretta. He leveled it at my chest. The room went silent. Su Min watched with breathless anticipation. I didn't move. I looked at the barrel of the gun, then up at his eyes. Shoot me then, I said, my voice trembling but clear. If you believe I sold you, pull the trigger. Do it. His finger tightened on the trigger. I saw the conflict warring behind his eyes. Logic told him I was a traitor. The evidence was right there. In his world, trust was a weakness that got you killed. But his hand, the hand of the most ruthless killer in Seoul, was shaking. He looked at my hands, the hands that had washed his wound. He looked at my dress, the one I had worn while I guarded his sleep. He couldn't do it. With a roar of frustration, he pistol-whipped the air, slamming the gun down onto the desk with a deafening bang. Get out, he whispered. Gichul, get out, he roared, the sound tearing at his throat. Get out of my house. Get out of my city. If I see you in Seoul again, I will forget that you saved my life. You are dead to me. Do you hear me? You are dead. 2 guards stepped forward, grabbing my arms. They didn't treat me like a guest anymore. They treated me like garbage. Wait, I screamed as they dragged me backward. I locked eyes with Su Min. She was smiling, a small, triumphant, venomous smile. I was hauled through the hallway, down the stairs, and through the heavy front doors. They threw me. I landed hard on the wet pavement of the driveway. My hands scraped against the stone. My small bag of belongings was thrown after me, landing in a puddle. The heavy doors of the mansion slammed shut. The sound was final. I stood up slowly. The rain had started again, a cold drizzle that mixed with the hot tears on my face. I looked up at the towering fortress of the Jim Ryong estate. I was back where I started. Homeless. jobless, penniless. But I wasn't the same woman who had walked into the club 3 weeks ago. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wiped the tears from my cheeks, smearing my expensive makeup. I looked at the closed door, and then up at the window where I knew Soo-min was watching. "You missed," I whispered to the rain. I picked up my bag. I didn't run. I turned and began the long walk down the hill, back to the city that wanted to eat me alive. I had a target now, and I was going to burn her world to the ground. The rain was colder now, mixed with sleet that stung my face like tiny needles. I walked down the winding driveway of the estate, my cheap bag heavy on my shoulder, but my spine steel. Soo-min had won a battle, but I was already planning the war. I wasn't the scared girl in the jazz club anymore. I had stitched up a dragon. I could handle a snake. I never made it to the main road. A nondescript gray van screeches around the bend, blocking my path. Before I could react, the side door slid open and 3 men in ski masks jumped out. I didn't scream. I dropped my bag and raised my fists. When the first one reached for me, I drove my knee into his groin with everything I had. He crumpled without a sound. "Get the bitch." Another shouted in Korean. They rushed me. I clawed at eyes. I bit down on a forearm until I tasted blood, fighting with the desperate fury of someone who had nothing left to lose. But there were too many of them. Strong arms grabbed me from behind, pinning my arms to my sides. A damp rag smelling sickeningly sweet was clamped over my nose and mouth. I held my breath, thrashing, kicking out blindly. "Breathe, sweetheart," a voice whispered in my ear. My lungs burned. I gasped involuntarily. The darkness rushed in like a tide, dragging me under. Gi-chul sat in his darkened office, a bottle of scotch open on the desk next to the gun he hadn't been able to fire. He was drinking to drown the image of my face when he threw me out into the rain. The door opened. It was Secretary Park. He looked sick. Without a word, Park placed a tablet on the desk. "I ran a diagnostic on the security subnet," Park said, his voice hollow. "The logs were altered, but the backup server, it caught this." Gi-chul looked at the screen. It was time-stamped footage from yesterday afternoon. It showed my bedroom door. It showed Yoon Soo-min looking down the hallway, then slipping inside. She came out 2 minutes later, looking smug. The scotch turned to ash in Gi-chul's mouth. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The texts. The bank transfer. It was all smoke. He had exiled the only person who had ever shown him genuine loyalty. He had thrown the woman who saved his life to the wolves. So-min was standing by the window, examining her manicure. She didn't hear the storm coming until it was too late. Gi-chul stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the marble was the only warning. He didn't yell. He didn't strike her. He walked over to her, his presence filling the room with a terrifying, suffocating pressure. "You are dismissed," he said. His voice was devoid of all human emotion. It was the voice of a judge pronouncing a death sentence. "The engagement is terminated. Your family's contracts are void. By tomorrow morning you will be social poison in this city. Get out of my sight before I forget that I do not kill women." So-min turned pale, realizing the magnitude of her miscalculation. She fled without a word. Gi-chul's phone rang. An unknown number. He answered, putting it on speaker. A video feed popped up. I was tied to a metal chair in a dim, cavernous warehouse. My lip was split, and a bruise was blooming on my cheekbone, but my eyes were blazing with defiant fury. A hand entered the frame, holding a gun to my temple. The Viper's face appeared next to mine, grinning gold-toothed into the camera. "Look what I found wandering in the rain." Dragon Choi Min-sok laughed. "She fights hard for a discarded pet. Come and get her. Alone. Or I paint this warehouse with her brains." The call ended. Gi-chul didn't panic. He didn't rage. He went very, very still. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He walked to the wall behind his desk and pressed a hidden panel. A section of the bookshelf slid back, revealing an armory. He stripped off his suit jacket, his movements precise and economical. He strapped on a Kevlar vest. He loaded magazines with hollow point rounds. He selected 2 handguns and a tactical shotgun. He turned to Secretary Park, who was waiting by the door, pale but resolute. "Notify the cleaners," Gi-chul said, racking the slide of a pistol. "And tell the fire department to take their time tonight." "Sir?" Gi-chul looked up, his eyes burning with an apocalyptic fire. "Burn it all down." He didn't sneak up to the warehouse in the Incheon docks. He didn't look for a back door. Gi-chul drove his armored sedan straight through the main corrugated metal bay doors at 60 miles an hour. The crash was deafening. Metal screamed, wood splintered, and guards went flying like bowling pins. The car screeched to a halt in the center of the warehouse floor, steam hissing from the ruined radiator. Gi-chul stepped out of the wreckage, shotgun in hand. The Viper's men opened fire. Bullets sparked off the car's armored chassis and tugged at Gi-chul's clothing, but he didn't flinch. He moved like a demon, a blur of violence and precision. He fired the shotgun, clearing a path through the first wave of attackers. He transitioned to his handguns, moving cover to cover, every shot a kill. It was a massacre. He was a force of nature, driven by a singular, desperate need. He was cutting a path through hell to get to me. He kicked open the door to the foreman's office on the mezzanine level. Choi Min-sok was there, hiding behind me. He had his arm around my neck, the gun pressed hard against my temple. "Stop." The Viper screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Another step, and I kill her." Gi-chul froze. He was breathing hard, covered in dust and other men's blood. His eyes found mine. I looked at him. I saw the agony in his eyes, the desperate fear that he was too late. Then, I looked down. A tiny red dot from Gi-chul's laser sight was hovering not on the Viper's head, but on his exposed shoulder, just inches from my ear. I understood. He needs an opening. I didn't hesitate. I threw my head back with all my strength, smashing the back of my skull into the Viper's nose. Crack. He howled in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second as he stumbled backward. That was all Gi-chul needed. Bang. The shot was deafening in the small office. The Viper jerked violently and collapsed backward, a neat hole in his forehead. Silence fell over the warehouse. Gi-chul dropped his gun. He rushed to me, his hands shaking so violently he could barely undo the knots. He pulled the ropes free, and I fell forward into his arms. He caught me, sinking to his knees on the dirty floor, pulling me tight against his chest. He buried his face in my neck, his whole body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline and terror. "Ava," he gasped, his voice broken, unrecognizable. "Ava, forgive me. I almost lost you. I almost lost you." I held on to him, smelling the gunpowder and sweat and blood on his skin. I felt his heart hammering against mine, alive and terrified. "You came," I whispered into his shoulder, tears finally spilling over. "You came back for me. They say Seoul is a city that never sleeps. But tonight, the Velvet Lounge was the dream everyone wanted to be part of." The air didn't smell like stale smoke and desperation anymore. It smelled of fresh orchids, expensive perfume, and victory. The spotlight hit me, but it didn't burn, it caressed. I wore a gown of liquid gold silk that shimmered with every breath I took, a far cry from the cheap polyester dress I had worn 6 months ago. I held the final note of the song, letting it swell and fill the renovated room before cutting it off into a perfect, ringing silence. Thunderous applause erupted. It wasn't polite. It was raucous, adoring, and loud enough to shake the crystal chandeliers. I smiled, bowing deeply. As I walked off the stage, Mr. Choi, the manager who had once thrown my coat into the rain, was waiting in the wings. He was holding a clipboard, his head bowed low. "Mrs. Kim," he said, his voice trembling with respect. "The champagne shipment has arrived. Do you want to inspect it?" "Not tonight, Choi," I said, breezing past him. "Handle it, and make sure the band gets a bonus." "Yes, ma'am." Immediately. I walked across the floor. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. Men in suits nodded respectfully. Women whispered behind their fans. I wasn't just the entertainment anymore. I was the owner. I was the woman who had tamed the dragon. I headed straight for the center VIP booth, the only table that mattered. Gichol was waiting. He wasn't looking at his watch. He wasn't bored. He was leaning back, one arm draped over the velvet seat, watching me with a look of absolute, terrifying adoration. He looked devastating in a tuxedo, the king of the underworld at ease in his throne room. I slid into the booth next to him. There was no broken glass this time. He reached for the bottle of vintage wine, one that cost more than my old apartment, and poured a glass for me himself. He took my hand, lifting it to his lips. His thumb traced the heavy diamond ring that sat on my finger, a rock large enough to have its own gravitational pull. "Did I disturb the performance?" he asked, his voice low and teasing, echoing the words he had spoken the night I slapped him. I looked at him, my husband, my partner, my equal. "Only a little," I whispered, leaning in until our lips were inches apart. "But I think I'll keep you." I kissed him, and the room disappeared. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I was walking into a cage. But sometimes, life doesn't give you what you ask for. It gives you what you're strong enough to take. I didn't just survive the fire. I became the flame. I slapped a monster in the dark, and in doing so I woke up a king. And the best part? The king bows to no one. Except me.